Good morning, everybody. I should first of all apologise for my voice, which is failing me, but I will press on nonetheless and try and give you some insights, some personal, some official, about the experience that Australia had in the centenary of our federation, which was way back in 2001. That's the celebration, by the way. The federation actually took place in 1901. I guess in some ways Australia and Canada are often compared to one another, so some of the things that distinguished our centenary celebrations perhaps are also relevant in Canada. And here I'm thinking about the fact that we're relatively young countries. We've got a colonial background. In our case we had one colonial master. Canada had a couple, both multi-ethnic populations. We've got a federal structure like Canada, and so there's quite distinctive regional identities, and there's often a divide between the metropolitan centres and those that are outside those centres. So some of these themes had to be wrestled with in the centenary celebrations in 2001. I guess the first thing to say about our experience was that our commemorations were deliberately designed to be inclusive. It sounds fairly obvious, but in a country as large as Australia, operating across several different time zones, that was quite a challenge, and the different celebrations and the design of the year was intended deliberately to ensure that everybody, from the most humble community organisation all the way through to large national projects, rippled across the country as best we could, and of course the Indigenous community was a big part of that as well. Our celebrations in 2001 topped off a couple of years where Australia did a lot of partying, actually. We're pretty good at parties. In fact, we take our parties frightfully seriously. In 1988, we had the bicentennial of the British landing in Sydney. And then in 2000, of course, we hosted the Olympic Games in Sydney. So both of those events were very Sydney-centric. People in Sydney thought that was pretty right. People in the rest of the country thought perhaps that was a little slanted. So the 2001 celebrations were deliberately designed to, if you like, get out of Sydney and focus on the rest of the country. Part of the focus for the year was on trying to understand the democratic evolution of Australia. Of course, Australia was a country that's been formed without any wars. We've done it through the old-fashioned, boring way of consultation and compromise. So maybe that explains why we're so good at partying. One of the things that we realised when we were planning for the celebration was that most Australians didn't have much of a clue about the history of the country. In fact, some research that was done just before the year found that less than a fifth of the country knew the name of our first Prime Minister. Okay, he was a pretty dull, grey kind of lawyer guy, but nonetheless, it's hard to imagine too many countries where hardly anybody knows who the heck the first Prime Minister was. Needless to say, this sparked a big public relations campaign where people were asking themselves, what sort of a country is this, where we don't even know the name of our first Prime Minister, and everybody then memorised who he was, if not what he did, and perhaps a little bit more about him. In addition to looking backwards, the celebration was also very much about generating debate about Australia, where it's going. Again, being a young country with a somewhat fragile national identity outside the sporting arena, there's often a pretty rich vein of debate about what sort of a country are we in, what sort of future issues are facing Australia, and where are we going. Okay, so that's sort of the context. Some of the nuts and bolts of how we went about it. About 8 years before the 2001 celebrations, an advisory committee was set up that essentially delivered a report recommending different options for celebrating the centenary. Shortly after this report was handed to the government, and both the federal and the state and territory governments were involved intimately in the process, a national council was established. Again, this was something that was a federal, state, territory project that was co-owned by all levels of government, and it was funded to the tune of about $50 million. Some of it was for a secretariat, some for specific celebrations, some for education campaigns and outreach, and some for communications and public affairs. On top of that, there was a so-called Federation Fund was set up, about $1 billion was set up, and the intention of that was to try and create a lasting legacy from the year in terms of projects around the country. This was divided into three basic categories. The first was called major projects. So, for example, under this fund, a national museum was built in Canberra, the capital, which is focused very much on telling the story of Australia. There was also an expansion of the National War Memorial, also in Canberra, which is one of the great sort of shrines of the Australian nation. Then there were several different other categories, the main ones being cultural heritage projects and some community projects. Okay, so let's get on to what the major events were during the year. There are about 4,000. You'll be pleased to hear I'm not going to go through each and every one of them in detail, and please don't ask me any questions about them. I was there, but my memories of the year are somewhat hazy. So it was obviously a huge success. There were some sort of headliner events, if you like. These were inevitably, I suppose, called centrepiece events. And they involved every state and territory hosting at least one of them. Some of the big states took on more than one, of course. Again, I mentioned earlier that Australia's, like Canada, it's a very diverse country, but most of the population's sort of clustered, huddled, some would say, around the coastline. So there's often a perception in Australia, as well as outside Australia, that the place is kind of focused on the road that runs between Sydney and Melbourne, and everybody else in the country is kind of irrelevant. So there was a big focus in these centrepiece events on getting out into what we call the outback, the countryside, internal Australia. So, for example, some of the big events, let me just mention a few. There was a thing called the New Dawn on 1 January, which was in a place called Alice Springs. Some of you who have been to Australia know that's in central Australia. And that was focused really on, if you like, relaunching Australia, rebadging Australia, or reinterpreting Australia, depending on your point of view. Anyway, it was a big gathering of different people. There was also the largest ever gathering of Indigenous folks at a big festival, also just outside Alice Springs. So Australia's got a long history. The white settlement of Australia is obviously recent, but the history of Aboriginal settlement in Australia was a big theme of the year. And they've been in Australia 50, 60, some might say even 70,000 years. But in all that time, there'd never been a gathering as large as this particular gathering that took place. The Aboriginal communities in Australia were very dispersed. So it was beyond a social experience, it was almost a religious experience for some of the Aboriginal performers and other people who were involved in this particular event. Again, this theme of decentralised celebrations can be seen in something that happened in a town called Townsville, which is in tropical Australia. So at dusk in Townsville, which is in Queensland, by the way, a huge crowd gathered on the shoreline. It was kind of like a Queensland pageant. Think of Saskatchewan, only hotter. With lots and lots of large steaks and, serious beer drinking was going on. And this was designed, if you like, as a sort of a blend of national and regional pride. It was a hugely important event for tropical Australia to, if you like, see itself as part of the country, and for the rest of the country to see tropical Australia as part of the country more broadly. In addition to those, there were lots of parades and celebrations. The main one I'd mention is that the Parliament, the Australian Parliament, which is now, of course, in Canberra, its original home was in Melbourne during the period while Melbourne and Sydney were bickering about which of them would host the capital. They ended up compromising and creating a new city. But during the first 20 years of Federation, the Parliament was actually temporarily parked in Melbourne. So during the 2001 year, it decamped from Canberra, went back to Melbourne, for a little while to sort of recreate that era. Some of the more popular celebrations in Australia crisscross state boundaries. So, for example, there was an event called the Source of the Sea. It was a flotilla of boats, old and new, that went down out the Murray River, which is a large river in Australia separating the states of New South Wales and Victoria. and South Australia. And it was a great, if you like, interpretation of the importance of that riverway to the Federation. Perth and Adelaide, Perth's our most western city, and Adelaide, which is in South Australia, were linked by a train of 31 carriages, and that commemorated the opening of the Transcontinental Railway. And this railway was one of the great promises that persuaded Western Australia to join the Commonwealth, so we like to keep them, like to remind them of that occasionally. Also, there was a Federation Air Show was shown at the time, and it was held in the outback region of Australia, where Qantas, our national airline, was established, and where the Flying Doctor Service, some of you may have heard that Australia's got a rather famous Flying Doctor Service, was also established. So in addition to those headliner events, there are also some lower key endorsement programs. This was essentially seed funding from the governments aimed at encouraging individual organisations at the community level to put on their own festivals, parades, sporting events, academic symposia, lecture series, you name it. These range from quite serious lectures about where Australia was headed to slightly more trivial events. I'm, of course, interested in the more trivial ones. One of them, for example, which tickled my fancy, was the one particular town, which I won't name, started up a Federation Father beard growing contest. Most of our Fathers of Federation had pretty spectacular beards, and some guys in some little town in Australia spent many months perfecting their Santa Claus look. It's very amusing. So in addition to those two categories, there are also a whole set of national projects, and as I said earlier, these were really focused on leaving an enduring legacy from the year. These range from commemorative medallions were struck, about 2 million of them were struck and distributed to school children as a memento of the year. A website was set up that was aimed at collecting local histories, particularly from certain regions of the country, from communities across the country, to tell oral history and written history of their areas. There was also a special display of Federation documents, founding documents from the Federation in our National Archives. Some of these events also spilled over into offshore areas. So, for example, there was an Australia Week in London during the January period of 2001. There was a series of travelling arts festivals and so on into Asia. Believe it or not, there was also Australia was also featured during Winterlude in Ottawa, I'm told. I wasn't here, but I'm not too sure what that feature was. Maybe a nice sculpture or Australians falling over on the canal. Who knows? So maybe just to sort of wrap up, I think, of course, the year was primarily a celebration. It was a party, and I guess that's rightly so. It was also a time for criticism. Australians are quite good at criticising themselves. So, for example, some of the public lectures that were held during the year, some of those individuals pretty much pointed a machine gun down the main street of Australian history and let rip. And that was an interesting sort of dynamic, if you like, between the balance between praising ourselves and celebrating our past, but also in some ways lamenting our past. So finding that right balance in the celebrations was difficult, and some people were quite critical of the celebrations for being too triumphalist and not, if you like, critical enough of some of the dark episodes in Australian history. And of course, many of those were, as you would well be aware of, in regard to the treatment of the Indigenous population in Australia in the early years of settlement, and even into the 20th century. But I guess from my perspective, the year was overall a positive. It certainly left some positive long-term legacies, and they range from things like concrete projects, like building railways that link major centres. For example, the Alice Springs to Darwin Railway was constructed, to the slightly more nebulous positives, such as the improvement in public knowledge and enhanced civic pride in Australia's history and our achievements as a country.